In the console wars of the mid to late 2000s, I was all about Team Xbox. Despite the fact that I had grown up with the PlayStation 2, I quickly swapped over to the Xbox 360 simply because of the cost of the console. I think was the biggest contributing factor when I was a kid in terms of which one I purchased. But nowadays, I think the PlayStation 3 comes out as the better system to collect for. I know there's been many videos in the past where I've mentioned the fact that the Xbox 360 collection is great because it's something that you can play on the newer hardware. But for a similar reason, the PlayStation 3 is great because you can't play it on the newer hardware. These are games that are restricted to the PlayStation 3 because I think it's very unlikely that we ever see native PS3 backwards compatibility become a thing, especially disc-based, on the newer consoles. So collecting these games on the PlayStation 3 to play on the PlayStation 3 is going to be your best way to experience them without being tied down to some sort of subscription service or ending up paying for something you don't want to otherwise have. PS3 sits in an interesting spot because the system has become easier to emulate on PC and because the system is very easy to mod yourself using just a simple USB flash drive. It's not some sort of more complicated hardware mod like the 360 has, and as a result, in theory, you can play any PS3 game you want via a backup copy that you may be able to find online, which also kind of dilutes the value of PS3 games, which for that reason it seems like in most cases purchasing the PS3 disc is going to be cheaper than purchasing an Xbox 360 disc, especially if the game is one that has backwards compatibility on the Xbox One, which if you want to play the game that way, that's great. Otherwise, I think that the PS3 is a great direction to go. The reason comes in the longevity that I think this platform provides. Whereas the Xbox 360 games are on DVDs, the PlayStation 3 has all of its games on Blu-rays. I think that creates a huge difference in terms of reliability. When I buy used PS3 and Xbox 360 games, more often than not, the PS3 ones are the ones where I flip the disc over in the store and it's in much better shape, or it's at least in a condition that I believe is going to be very readable when I put it into the system. The Xbox 360, as I see more and more of these used games cropping up at thrift stores, pawn shops, whatnot, I see them and I'm like, I don't really know if I take that home if it's actually going to work. It's going to have to be a game that is really collectible and really desirable to me for me to even give it a shot, when it looks like it's kind of been ran across the floor a few times, because that's how a lot of these DVD-based games work. Not to mention the fact that I believe the Blu-ray discs are going to have more longevity just in general from things like disc rot that we started to see kind of make their way into the PlayStation 2 games in that era. And the system is pretty reliable too. Obviously the Xbox 360 Slim is great, but there's a ton of fat Xbox 360s out there that while I personally have not had problems with mine overheating, I've definitely had problems with mine having disk drive issues, even on some of the Xbox 360 Slims I've used, whereas the disk drives on my PS3 Slims have held up a lot better. Now, the PS3 Fat, particularly the backwards compatibility one, I've owned a couple of, which sounds great. You can play PS2 games on your PlayStation 3, but I've had nothing but problems with the fat PlayStation 3s that I've owned. They've been yellow light of death non-stop and just hard to keep running, and that's why I recommend the Slim or the Super Slim. And then obviously there's a very notable library of games on the PlayStation 3 that are just worth checking out. And a lot of these games, like say Uncharted, had a huge print run. They were very popular back in the day. And if you didn't get a chance to play something like Infamous or Uncharted and you want to check them out now because you never owned a PlayStation 3 back then, these are some of the cheaper games to buy. And while games don't necessarily go, for $1 or $2, it seems like at pawn shops anymore, maybe you're kind of bottoming out at about a $5 price for a lot of these games. Many of them are still worth that. These HD graphics hold up relatively well for most titles, and I will say that the PlayStation 3's earlier years definitely have games that have a lot more compromises and were probably better played on the Xbox 360, but as you move more towards 2009, 2010 release dates, I think those PlayStation 3 copies edge out as kind of the better ones to play if you're not taking into account the newer hardware if the games are available backwards compatibility on the Xbox One. And for some gamers, this library contains really the last games from their franchises that were important to them. That might be the NCAA sports series, that might be just the competition among sports games within each sport, or it might be the fact that racing games have deteriorated since then. Various other games have had their overall sense of pride taken away from them as newer versions of the games have felt like sellouts, I guess. And I do have some interest in building up a little bit of a back catalog of kids games to play with my daughter. And ultimately, this was kind of the last generation where we saw those movie tie-in games. You can say what you want about a video game based on WALL-E or Up, but the reality is these type of movies don't get games anymore. And if they do, they're even more shallow than they were before. This was an era where a lot of these games were like a 3D platformer, typically like a buddy platformer, where maybe up to 4 players were supported on screen, or at least 2. And that's something that you don't see anymore in the very, very few movie tie-ins that are released. And in fact, we don't see that many kids games with licensed properties that kids are into or interested in that have other tie-in material anymore. And that's just because game development costs have risen so much in the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One generation. Of course, if you really are looking for a huge library of those sort of kids tie-in licensed titles, that's going to be best found in the GameCube and the PlayStation 2 era, when they seemed like they were coming out non-stop. And of course, there's going to be definite varying qualities with any of these, but at least on the PlayStation 3, you're able to get them in a next generation sort of HD style that's not found on the PlayStation 2 or the GameCube. So that's my thoughts on collecting for the PlayStation 3, and while I definitely think it's still worth doing, 1, because of the cost, 2, because of the durability, and 3, because this was really the last platform to house many of these classic type of games that you just don't see anymore. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Bailey, and I will see you in the next video.